Welcome back to the first session of the fourth Asia Finance Forum, Reinventing Finance for Sustainability and Inclusion. And we are very looking forward to this because we are talking about green and blue finance, new tools to fight climate change. As the title indicates, we are talking about solutions, and this session will be moderated by Ms. Sharanjit Lail. She is a senior broadcast journalist and presenter who, for example, until recently anchored and produced Asia Business Report and Newsday from the BBC's Asia Bureau in Singapore. So I guess many of you know her already from your TV screen. Now she's here moderating our first session. So we are very excited, looking forward to an interesting conversation with our panelists. Over to you, Sharanjit.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jost. Lovely introduction, and it is such a wonderful privilege to be here. A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today for this special webinar. Now, as you heard from Jost, this is the first of 3 sessions for the ADB's Asia Finance Forum, where we will delve into formulas and strategies for reinventing finance for sustainability and inclusion. It's a real privilege for me to lead this important discussion with experts in the field, where we will explore green and blue finance and how these can be tools to fight climate change. Of course, we know that acting on climate change is urgent. Human actions have caused our planet to overheat, and the effects of these are natural disasters, severe storms, and unpredictable weather patterns. Well, it's time to stop this urgent warming of the planet and find the right solutions for environmental problems such as climate change, pollution, and overfishing. Now, one of these solutions is money. That's right, massive capital outlays are needed to finance ways to reduce pressure on ecosystems and communities. Well, the current financing gap in green and blue finance in Asia is due to several challenges that investors face in scaling financing towards both. So please join me in welcoming our expert panelists who will discuss a range of solutions for closing this urgent gap. I'm joined by Denton Rarava. He's a senior advisor for economics and acting director for programs and initiatives at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Welcome. We also have Eliazar Ricote, the deputy executive director from the PPP Center in the Republic of the Philippines. We have Ernst Rauch, the chief climate scientist from Munich Re. And finally, we have Regula Sheg, Managing Director for Asia at Circulate Capital in Singapore. Well, welcome to all of you. Now, we're hoping to have an engaging and insightful session for the next hour or so. And then after that, I shall open it up to questions from all of you watching, because we want you, the audience, to participate in this webinar. So please use the Q&A chat box in the ADB AFF web app or Event Boost platform to pose your questions to our expert panelists. Well, let's kick off and start with the first question. Now, all of you are experts at this. You all have very different backgrounds and perspectives. And I'd like to first understand how each of you see the area of green finance. What kind of financial innovations are needed to bring new products to the market? And how can these products be designed and brought to market at scale? Let's start with you, Denton.
Thank you very much, Sharanjit, and let me thank the organizers of this very important forum for the invitation. I'm from the Pacific Islands, where climate change is really, we are at the forefront of climate change, and our leaders have identified climate change as our greatest threat. And several of our countries or members are in the top 10 vulnerable countries in the world in terms of climate change. So this is a very important issue for us. And it's good that we are looking for solutions, because at this stage, we are desperate for solutions. Otherwise, we will not have Pacific Islands anymore. But what we are doing in the Pacific in terms of the blue and green bonds, these are important instruments that we are working with our partners to assist our member countries in terms of addressing climate change impacts. And so we are working with, for example, the United Nations Development Program, and looking at researching blue and green bonds. We're working with United Nations ESCAP, looking at issues like climate change, debt for climate change swaps, which some countries are interested in. Because we are living climate change, we're desperately looking for solutions to address this situation. And might I remind us all, Pacific Islands countries are not responsible for this issue, but we are bearing the brunt. We're suffering the brunt of these impacts of climate change. So any solutions, we're very much interested in it, but solutions that don't overwhelm our very small economies, that don't add more debt to our economies. So these are important considerations for us. But we look forward to the outcomes of this very important workshop or forum. Thank you, Saranjit.
Well, thank you for that, Denton. And as you say, the Pacific Islands are at the forefront of climate change. So this need to act and try to come up with innovative solutions is incredibly urgent, particularly for you and everyone else who lives in the Pacific Islands and other fragile communities that are exposed to climate change. Now, Eliezer, I move on to you. Give us your sense of perspective of the kind of green finance solutions, innovative solutions that we can come up with, and also how to build them up to scale. That's another big issue, isn't it?
Thank you, Sajid. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eliezer. I'm Eli Ricotta from the Philippines. Happy to be joining you today, this afternoon. Thank you, ADB. ADB is based in Manila, and we're always happy to participate in very important conversations like this. I'm with the national government's PPP Center, Public-Private Partnership Center, with the agency mandated to facilitate, help, assist, guide all PPP initiatives at the Philippine government in various aspects, policy, projects, and programs. To answer your question, I think the very broad answer would be by creating an enabling environment that has in it policies, programs, and projects that promote and incentivize private sector participation, institutional participation in funding green infrastructure and urban development, natural resource management, innovation, and at least in the same way as well, encourage private sector participation, because they are the ones who can bring in the innovation, of course, financing, efficiency, and innovation that government may not have the resources or the capacity to do so. What we did in the Philippines, in response to this, at least, our Central Bank of the Philippines, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, has issued a circular and sustainable finance framework in 2020. That's a concrete policy to set out the expectations on the integration of sustainability principles by the banks in the Philippines. And the government also has gotten together, or various agencies, several agencies involved, environmental management, climate change commission, infrastructure agencies, local governments. We put together a Philippine Sustainable Finance Roadmap and put together a Philippines Interagency Technical Working Group on sustainable finance, and engage the private sector, engage the local banking industry here, discuss how we can put together these instruments and sustain them. This roadmap actually very clearly defines the things that are needed, and in response to the issues. Broadly, I think the issues are the need for strong coordination. I think the financial ecosystem, both government and private, needs to get together, see the need, and have a common ground in responding to sustainability and inclusion requirements. Number two is lack of awareness, and I think this conversation is a good response to that. And finally, transparency and the availability of database and projects. So this framework that we have, a roadmap, is anchored in three key pillars that we call. First, a conducive environment. As I said, these are policy inputs and actions of government. Second is mainstreaming sustainable finance, a financing pillar. This is to promote sustainable financing products, incentives and penalties, leveraging available financing and establishing a sustainable insurance mechanism, if you may. And finally, sustainable pipeline pillar, coming up with the pipeline of projects can work together on this one. A smaller effort on the part of the PPP Center, at least 4 PPPs, we put together what we call a resiliency framework for a resiliency portfolio of projects. And this is enabled to a large degree by the support from the Asian Development Bank in Manila, particularly the funding from the Urban Climate Resiliency Trust Fund, or UCCRTF, for putting together a portfolio of projects on climate resilient projects in 12 provinces and 4 metros in Metro Manila. So putting together a real database of projects we can eventually make available to the market, probably scale them and make these funds, be realized and actually generate actual investments. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Ellie. And as you say, there is a long list of things that
yes.
you and your organization are doing. You're working with multilateral development banks like the ADB, you're working with the central bank. So indeed, there can be solutions. And I look forward to getting more into that discussion with you
yes.
As we go into this. Ernst, let's move to you now. Give us a sense of what you think needs to happen with green finance, the kind of innovative solutions we can come up with, and also this necessity to build it up to scale.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharanjit, and thank you to the organizer for having me on this panel. Good morning here from Germany, and good afternoon to all of you. While working for a reinsurance company, our DNA is to identify, to measure, and to manage risks. So we are essentially a risk management company, and climate change and the impact from climate change, but also the questions around potential solutions is on our agenda and part of our business development strategy since decades. Actually, it goes back to the 1970s. It always starts, and here I go back to what I refer to as the DNA of an insurance company, is identifying risks, and then from there take it on to quantify and measure risk, and only then you can develop solutions. And solutions, when we talk about climate change, historically have been mainly with respect to providing solutions on natural catastrophe risk transfer, so improving resilience by financial payouts after a major catastrophe. But we have moved on a couple of years ago into the technology space. For instance, when we talk about the need to mitigate emissions or to reduce emissions globally, but especially also in industrial countries and developing emerging countries, so we need new technologies, and these new technologies have to be brought to market at scale. We talk about renewable energy and others. And here we realize still that investors are hesitant because to invest into these technologies, because they don't necessarily fully understand the risks. And so we, as an insurance or reinsurance company, we put these risks on our balance sheet. But having said this, we are also an investor. An insurance company is both a risk management companies. Again, that's the core of our business, but also as an investor. And as an investor, we both structure bonds, catastrophe bonds, but also we investing into catastrophe bonds. And to your question, Sharanjit, how to bring these solutions at scale? We believe, and that's also my personal experience, having worked for quite a while in the public-private partnership domain, partnerships are essential. If you have a new product, a new solution, a financial solution, a technology solution or so, you need to have partners, right partners, both in the public domain, but also in the private domain, to bring these solutions to the market, and especially to tailor the solutions to the needs of, for instance, governments. And that's what we are working on through a number of organizations where we are a member with, for instance, the Insurance Development Forum, where there are development banks part of, but also UN organizations and the private sector. And with these collaborative efforts, that's, I believe, one of the key elements to bring these solutions to the markets, which are so urgently needed. And again, it is about public and private sector collaboration. I think neither the public sector alone nor the private sector alone will really tackle the order of magnitude of the climate challenge in a way which is appropriate. And we heard it from Denton, especially, small island states are suffering most. And I think this is where there has to be a focus on when it comes to financial products to improve resilience. And there are a number of these innovative products out there. And I guess we will discuss this later in the calls. Thank you. And back to you, Sharanjit.
Thank you, Ernst. Yes, I look forward to discovering what these new financial products are, and really curious to hear you mention that, of course, a lot of investors are, required to get into these financial products, but really they want to understand the risks behind it. And as a result, as you say, many are reluctant. So another big challenge is how to reassure them that these are the right kind of investments and that they are safe investments. And interesting that you mentioned, of course, we're talking about green and blue bonds, but there are also catastrophe bonds. So really fascinating to hear a little bit more from your perspective as we start our conversation. And finally, Regula, over to you. What do you think needs to happen in terms of innovative green finance and the urgent need to get them up to scale?
Well, good afternoon, and thanks so much for having me at this panel to hopefully contribute to a very important topic. I'm representing Circular Capital here. We are an investment management firm based in Singapore, and we're bridging the capital, the financing gap in finding solutions, systemic solutions to tackling the ocean plastic leakage. So what we have seen upfront that there are several reasons why institutional capital has not yet sufficiently entered into the industry to invest in companies and infrastructure and solutions in these markets in South and Southeast Asia where the biggest leakage is happening. And so what we really need to understand first, I think, to attract more capital generally into green finance or blue finance is, what is the systemic problem we have at hand, and what are the systemic solutions we need? And I think particularly for investments, not to just look at low-hanging fruits and investment opportunities, but really tackle the entire supply chain, build up the entire supply chain needed to tackle the issue, particularly also in plastic leakage. What I think is also important is beyond an enabling environment to invest in is really the role of the corporations, right? There is a role for governments, and we heard it. There's a role for governments to enable an inclusive investment landscape, but corporations also play a key role, not only as maybe catalytic capital providers coming in early stage to make institutional investors more comfortable, and with that some sort of de-risk the investment opportunities early stage, but also in being part of building such a supply chain, and particularly in the area of plastic recycling, right? Our corporates or our investors are our corporations, but they're also the ones who are actually interested in the offtake of the material recycled. So obviously corporations in that sense, in finding systemic solutions, also play a key role. And then there are obviously also the consumers themselves, right? In our area, we're investing in plastic recycling and ocean plastic prevention, is that the consumer themselves have a key role to play in understanding what they consume, how they consume it, how can they contribute to recycling content, etc. I mean, it is really a systemic problem we have at hand, where we need systemic solutions, and where we need all stakeholders to come together and build an ecosystem which makes sense, right? And we can go into more details what that means in a sense of ocean plastic prevention.
Thank you, Regula. Really great to hear what Circular Capital is doing to try to tackle the issue of the plastics problem. And as you say, you know, a supply chain is necessary. You need to build up those supply chains to scale up. And I look forward to hearing more of these innovative solutions going forward. Now, Denton, back to you. You know, you talked about the fragility of your Pacific island states and really how crucial it is to try to tackle this crisis head on as soon as we can, sooner rather than later. So give us a sense of the kind of specific financial innovations that a small island state like yours needs. Of course, we know these are states that are so gravely threatened by climate change.
Yeah, thank you. You know, the Pacific Islands countries, they live this cycle of damage, recovery, damage, recovery. Yeah, this year you have a cyclone and it's damage, wipe your economy, then you start rebuilding. And then next year, another cyclone comes and damages the whole, everything. And you're back to recovery mode again. Now, that happens every year, and for all the small Pacific Island economies, sometimes we receive grants or concessional loans to rebuild, but even concessional loans, these are debt, and as a result, these countries end up incurring high debt levels. And at the moment, most of the Pacific Island countries are now approaching high debt distress levels as they try to recover from the impacts of climate change. And as I said earlier, being small also makes it very difficult. You have limited resources, you have limited access to outside funding. The funding we get is from bilateral donors and multilateral development partners like the Asian Development Bank, World Bank. But these are the issues that we have to live with, and the areas that we are looking forward to is how we can address these climate change issues, but at the same time continue to develop, continue to manage our economies in a way that we survive. And so for us, it's an existential issue. That is maybe unlike other countries in the world, the big countries in the world. But I must say that the Pacific Islanders are very resilient people. And they come out of disasters. And we have lived in this region for 6,000, 7,000 years. So we will continue to do that. But as we go along, as the climate change problem intensifies or builds up, we will need to find other solutions. And that's why maybe the green and blue bonds would assist us, would help us, and also enable us to develop our economies. Just another point I want to mention. We are very small island countries, but together we are very large. We refer to ourselves as the Blue Pacific continent. We are very large ocean states. And anything, or any innovations that takes place in the ocean space, I think we will look forward to that. And this is an area that our governments are trying to ensure that the ocean provides for our needs. Thank you.
I think that is an extraordinary response. And as you say there, the ocean is crucial for your nation. It is crucial for the planet. And it brings me very nicely to what Regula was talking about earlier, this need to eradicate ocean plastics. Of course, one of the most widely discussed global environmental issues of the past few years. Now, you mentioned, Regula, that Circular Capital has designed highly innovative financial responses to all of this. So give us a sense of what they are, or the flavor of these financial innovations.
Yes. So let me maybe start with what is the status quo? What has been happening? So when we started tackling the issue of plastic waste and material recovery and ocean plastic prevention, we really needed to understand. So where is the situation, or how is the situation in South and Southeast Asia? It's clear that there is lack of infrastructure, right? And there's also lack of government funding to tackle those issues, knowing that the governments have their own needs and have many different areas they need to tackle. We saw clearly a lack of capital. This industry has been chronically underserved and by the conventional financial industry, and has also not been understood, because we also see material or plastic as waste, right? And we haven't started valorizing it. But the moment we start valorizing material, whether it is plastic or it is paper or whatever material we consume, there is actually then the opportunity to create an economic model around that. So I think that's the first step. So we knew and saw that there is lack of infrastructure, there's lack of capital from institutional investors. There was also lack of visible pipeline. And it's one other reason why there is not yet sufficient institutional capital in this market, because you need to understand what you can invest in, right, to be able to do so. And there is lack of evidence-based track record. Institutional investors need to understand what is the return, right, beyond the impact you can have. And so with that understanding, we started really building a first fund, the Ocean Fund, which was mainly a corporate fund. Corporations which understood and saw the problem at hand, and wanted to be part of the solution. So this is different to a typical investment fund, right? Where really corporates such as Pepsi-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Dow, Danone, Chanel, Unilever, Coke, Chevron, Philips, and Mondelez invested in us. And we were able to actually get a de-risking or a blended finance mechanism built in to really, by the US DFC and USAID, to actually then bring this private sector together with the public sector, right? So that was the starting point where we could actually go into the area and start understanding at a country and then at a city level, what are the interventions needed to build a proper plastic recycling supply chain. And again, from a systemic approach, meaning it starts with collection of the material, which currently is either landfilled or burned or leaking into the ocean. Then next step is understanding what is the needed capacity build up to recycle that material, whether mainly mechanically these days. And then the third step is really what additional innovative solutions are needed to support the market and bring all the market players together. So I think that was really kind of an innovative approach to how we tackle the ocean plastic leakage problem. Then what is also important is that our investors, our corporates, they do not just serve as investors per se, but as I mentioned before, they're really also key in the offtake of the material, because they committed to a recyclable content within a certain time frame, right, in their packaging. Therefore, they also have an interest in being an offtaker of the material. So we start connecting the market, right? We start connecting our corporates with those companies on the ground which actually recycle the content, the material. So that's a key part of our innovative approach. Then I think what is also important is that these corporations enable our companies to grow faster, to scale and to replicate by supporting them in bringing them to an international standard for them to be able to source, right? They enable and partner up with new product design and development. So it is really the strong interconnection between our entrepreneurs on the ground who need capital and technical assistance and our corporate investors who, beyond capital, then have an interest in supporting these companies to grow. And then I think what is really also important is that we, through other organizations and partners, as I mentioned, build an inclusive ecosystem. Now, I think we also have to understand that more than 60% of the plastic globally recycled is collected by the informal sector. And the informal sector, therefore, needs to be brought to the table as one key element and partner to solve this systemic problem we have at hand. And there also comes in the focus on beyond typical investment along the supply chain in bringing innovation and transparency into the market. Because we're talking here really about fair, equitable jobs, fair pricing, transparency and traceability of the material. So you see, so you have to, again, and really well understand what are the situations on the ground within those waste jets, what are all the key players, and how can we interconnect and work together in finding these solutions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great list of solutions you mentioned there, Regula. And I was particularly struck by you saying essentially it takes all the stakeholders to work together, to come together to resolve the big challenge that is ocean plastics. And of course, the corporate players that you mentioned, teaming up with the informal sector and others, it is so crucial. But this idea of the blended finance that you mentioned leads me very nicely into the next question that I will have to Eliaza, who is, of course, in charge of PPP areas. And as you say, blended finance is a way to bring different investments in from both public and private sectors. So Eliaza, what financial innovation do you think are needed to try to build these climate resilient infrastructure investments that we've been talking about via PPP, public-private partnerships?
Well, at least in the Philippines, first, the obvious response, investing in project development, structuring, developing projects that define very clearly the best mix of financing. So, and these are provided for in our laws, for example, in the Philippines. How do we put together a well-structured project that will encourage and make this project directed to this available financing, both from various sources, from government, from private sector, in specific projects, specific sectors that are responsive to this sustainability and financing requirements. We have in the Philippines, for example, the Project Development and Monitoring Facility. It's a pool of funds that we put together with, of course, ADB, our own resources of the Philippine government. We have structured we have a panel of firms from abroad that helps us put together these projects, define the best mix to finance this project, and then market them to prospective private partners. So I think that's one initiative along that line. As mentioned earlier, we have this Urban Climate Change Resilience Fund, uses RTF, added into this facility specifically for identifying projects that are climate disaster resilient in nature and define the best mix of financing, the best PPP modality that we can for this second projects. Number two, I think very good, important, at least from the point of view of government, linking these projects being identified before presenting them to the private sector to the targets of the government. We have SDG requirements, SDG targets, development plans. So we link this project and make them align so that we are, working along the same lines of priorities. And finally, capacitating our governments. Regula mentioned about people on the ground. In the Philippines has a devolved setup. Local governments are heavily involved in identifying the project, defining the project. They can be the ones, in fact, to enter into PPP. So capacitating local governments, local communities to understand how this project structure and the financing mechanism can work for them given these requirements.
Yeah, I mean, just a fascinating range of solutions. Again, as you mentioned, the Resilience Fund is already out there. So that is one solution that can tackle this urgent.
Quick addition to that, Sharanjit. All of what I'm saying was mostly initiated by government because I'm from government, so the perspective of the government. Regula pointed out a while ago that even private companies had an important role. And this is, I think, where a conversation such as this is very important. There are platforms for PPPs, for example, there are market sounding activities, there are regional dialogues where we present projects, solutions, innovations. A lot has been initiated, for example, by Infrastructure Asia and Singapore. So there are platforms, venues where we, government, the private sector, financial institutions can really get together and understand how we can, as you correctly pointed out, coordinate working together financial ecosystem.
That's right. I mean, we heard it earlier as well from Regular talking about all those different private companies that are involved, you know, the Unilevers and all the other big firms out there that are really trying to tackle this issue. I guess I can move to Ernst now. We know that, Ernst, your sector, reinsurance, is heavily exposed to climate impacts. You talked about catastrophe bonds, for instance, earlier. So what are the key climate-related financial innovations do you think we can expect to see in your sector in the future? Of course, there are lots that you already have in place, but what are the ones that you think will come up in the future? And how can the reinsurance sector continue to lead such innovations?
Yeah, we are most likely going to see more pool solutions. So where we see governments teaming up, plus the private sector joining governments in certain regions. There is already a pool in place since quite a while in the Caribbean, but also in the Pacific region, governmental pools are starting. And what is relatively new, that these pools not necessarily pay out after a major disaster based on sort of the losses occurred. So it's not really an indemnity-based solution. It's rather a parametric solution. And parametric means that weather parameters like wind speeds, rainfall amounts, or flood levels or so trigger the payout of such a pool solution. The advantage certainly is that this payout happens typically within 2 weeks after a disaster strikes. So there's really quick money flowing into these countries to help rebuilding and help actually already in the recovery phase after a disaster. And then further on, also supporting the build back better, as it's often referred to, which is absolutely necessary. We cannot continue, and that's neither in industrialized countries or OECD countries, nor in those countries who are suffering most, so in the developing and region like the Pacific Islands or so. We need to be aware that climate change is already around us. So we need to find solutions in the financial sector, be it on risk transfers or insurance type of solutions or financing solutions, where whenever there has been a disaster, the rebuilding after disaster has to be done in a different way, perhaps even including relocations. And that's also an innovation which is already out there, that certain products allow for sort of an extra payout in order to build back better to higher building standards, and even to allow for additional costs to replace. But the key is that such innovation cannot really happen and not really be used at scale if just single countries work on this. We need these collaborative efforts, and regional pools help because they bring down the risk premium and they help sort of pushing for these tailor-made solutions, because individual countries need individual solutions, and that's sort of a driver for this innovation. And let me add one other area of innovation, which is sort of indirectly only related to insurance. It was only last year that the government of Belize issued a blue bond. And the blue bond runs till 2040. And what was really innovative is that a bond still needs to be repaid. So there's an interest on this bond. However, if in the first years of the repayment by the government of Belize, catastrophes will affect the country of Belize, then there is a so-called catastrophe insurance wrapper around this bond. So insurance pays for the interest payments of the bond, so that the country, the government, is not sort of stressed double by having to repay the interest of the bond, plus having to deal with the catastrophe itself. So an interest or a loan service waiver or so, that's absolutely innovative, helping reducing this effect, this catastrophe effect, this double hit effect after a major disaster, paying back loans, plus having to deal with the catastrophe insurance plus bonds. That's sort of the new product, which is already out in the market. Belize is one of the first examples. Back to you.
No, that's really interesting to hear, Ernst. And as you say, there are solutions out there. The reinsurance industry has already come up with some of them. These pool solutions are really fascinating. And I guess at this stage, I want to throw it back to Denton, because, you know, Denton, you mentioned earlier that the Pacific Islands are exposed to so many catastrophes. And it's really interesting as well that you mentioned there are huge debt obligations when it comes to rebuilding. And the fact is, Pacific Islands are small. They are reliant on a lot of debt from other countries. And there's a real pressure to try to, you know, eradicate these, or at least find different ways that you can come up with solutions that will help some of the catastrophes that Pacific Islands face. So could you give us a sense of perhaps what you would like to see from someone like Ernst from the reinsurance sector, or Regular, who is putting together these solutions in her space, or even Ellie, who's talking about PPP? What kind of solutions amongst those that they've mentioned would work best for you as a Pacific Island nation?
Thank you, Saranjit. Yes, and as you are aware, the Pacific Islands are very small. Individually, they're very small. But if we come together as a group, I think we can make a difference, and we can attract people like Ernst to come, but only as a group. And just as an example, Ernst, we have insurance schemes cropping up in the region, and but there's a need to really think through all these things, think more about these things. I'll give you an example. Early this year, we had a volcanic eruption in Tonga. I'm not sure whether you guys have heard about it, but it's a huge eruption that generated a tsunami, and that tsunami destroyed the country of Tonga. And they went to this insurance company, but they are not eligible to be and the issue is that volcanic tsunami is generated by volcanic eruption, doesn't qualify. Tsunami is generated by an earthquake, can qualify, but not a volcanic eruption. So I think in designing these schemes, we may need to think about these things a bit more and think through them, whether they would help or benefit the countries taking up these insurance products. So that's just one example. But in terms of the region, trying to find solutions, I heard Eli talk about a resilience fund. The Pacific region is also working on a resilience fund facility that we hope will get it off the ground and get that operational. But maybe Eli would give me some information about their scheme so that I can learn a bit more from what you're doing in the Philippines. So you see, that's a potential benefit that's coming out from this discussion now. So
gladly,
I look forward to.
Thank you.
There you
Thank
go.
you very
You've
much.
brought two people together who can fix each other's problems. So Eli,
Thank you.
Ellie, tell us,
Absolutely.
give us a sense of what you could do to try to help the Pacific Islands and Denton with the issues they face.
Gladly. Thank you. We will. And I'd like to again raise the need for coordination, and ADB is doing a great job in making available to the people in the region and elsewhere the availability of these instruments. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the main problems is really awareness of what's available, mainstreaming them into the system, and transparency, and of course, database that will align and will reinforce this availability out there. Thank you.
That's great. Now, before I go to our closing question, I mean, we've still got a bit of time here, and we've been getting some great questions from the audience. All of you watching out there, thank you for sending through your questions. And I will go ahead and start asking some of these great questions that you've put in place, because there is a number of them, and I'd like to get to all of them before we end. So question here from Bucharest in Romania. What is the direct effect on green finance, the United Nations SDGs, of the current oil, gas, and electricity world crisis, with skyrocketing energy prices and related devastating inflation? Obviously, these are all multiple challenges that the world faces right now. So what impact is all of this having on green finance? Because the world's got to fix so many other problems first. With this war in Ukraine, rising inflation, rising energy prices. Will green finance be prioritized in all the multiple challenges that we face? So I guess that is the gist of that question. So if anybody wants to pick up that question and answer it.
Maybe I start first.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. We with all the challenges which we are having, we have to be aware that certain of these challenges are running on different time scales. Yes, we have the energy crisis, the supply crisis, the oil and gas, and all these crises which have been mentioned, and they have to get top priority. But nevertheless, we have in parallel other crises, not just building up, they're already there. The climate crisis is already there. And so we should not deprioritize climate change sort of below the other crises to fix. Unfortunately, I think we have to face reality. We have to work on these individual crises in parallel. I think it would be entirely wrong, especially our children and grandchildren would not necessarily forgive us if we sort of drop the climate crisis now or push it back to say, well, let's fix this one when we have already solved all the other topics or so. So what I'm trying to say is, unfortunately, yes, the world has become extremely challenging in the last months and years, and currently, yes, we are living in crucial times, not to forget the pandemic, actually, by the way, or so. But what is important is to face these crises and not just push them under the carpet and say, well, climate is not important anymore because we have to solve the energy problem or so. We need to do these things in parallel. And what is, I think, a very, very clear message from all this crisis, we cannot continue the way we run the world, we run this planet in the future as we did in the past. Resilience is not just a buzzword. So whatever we do, and also in the financial sector, and looking at tackling this crisis and finding solutions, they have to add to the resilience of our society. And I'm getting back to this very concrete example of not just financing or providing finance or insurance after a major natural catastrophe. Build back better. Have in mind that the world is not going to get easier and better when it comes to natural disasters. We clearly see as an insurance company or reinsurance company, the increasing frequency and intensity of the events. And Denton, I think, made it very clear how much they are suffering and feeling this or so. Let's not drop this from the agenda. Let's have them as top priority. Do things in parallel. Yes, it's a hard thing to do. And take resilience very seriously, and not just a buzzword and say, well, let's do this as we did it in the past, just a little bit different. It has to be very different, and we have to think about our future and the future of our children and grandchildren. Thanks to you.
Yeah, very well said, Ernst. And as you said there, it is crucial that this needs to be tackled, not for the next generation in 10 years from now, but now. And of course, Regular, I think you were going to jump in there, and I'd like to move on to you now, because as a fund, you are looking to raise money. So are you finding it more challenging now in this environment of, not just inflation and energy prices soaring, but the issues around the pandemic as well, these multiple challenges that so many investors are facing, these things that they need to tackle? Is it something that you feel is being prioritized, and is your company being prioritized alongside it?
Well, it's a very broad question, and I would like to answer that. But can I just build on just briefly on the actual oil
Absolutely.
price? Because I think we need that is actually something to really put into perspective in our case. So going back to the topic of valorizing plastics, right, and recycling of plastic, the higher the oil price, the more economical recycling becomes. We've done some studies, and it may not be absolute correct, but between $70 to $80 a barrel, or between $65 and $75 for a barrel of crude oil, means that plastic recycling is at par and becomes economically interesting. So obviously, the more pressure on the oil price, the more favorable the industry becomes in that sense. We have seen that as a big issue during COVID, right, in the beginning in early 2020, when we have a historically low oil price, which then really hit our companies and the development of the industry very hard. I think we talked and we heard from Ernst about climate crisis, right, climate change, and I think it's often not seen that actually plastic recycling is at the nexus of climate change, meaning that if we recycle material and we don't leak it or burn it, or we can prevent significant greenhouse gas reduction. So that is, I think, the current situation. It just confirms, right, that we need to move away and we need to move towards a circular economy where we use the material we have at hand and actually recycle it and not downcycling, but upcycling, closed loop, bottle to bottle. So exactly. So it is something where we should not stop. We should actually go even faster to understand that with the shortage of natural resources, it just makes absolute sense to recycle and go full circular. On your question, generally, I mean, we see the market is getting tighter, right? Capital, you see PEs out there not investing as quickly and deploy capital as fast as we've seen in the past. On our end, I must say, this concept of catalytic and showcasing to the institutional investors that there is enough pipeline out there. You can invest by having tremendous impact, yet also a good return. We've seen capital coming in, and we launched a new fund, which is not a corporate fund, but a institutional and private family foundation and private investor and family foundation fund. I'll just give you an example. EIB, European Investment Bank, announced that they commit to invest in our fund. So I think we see that there is continuous capital going in, and there is a clear understanding that this is exactly an area we need to invest heavily, despite all the global crises we have. So I think in our area, I think there is a common understanding that it's now time. We need to double up, and we need to invest to build the necessary infrastructure.
Thank you for that, Regula. And really crucial, as you mentioned there, it is all about circularity, isn't it? High oil prices does impact plastic, and everything else is all interlinked. So thanks for that response. I'll move on to the next question if nobody else would like to pick up on that response. Okay, I will go on to the next one. And this is a really fascinating one, because I guess the issue around green and blue bonds, we've been talking about them a lot. They are one solution to help resolve the many challenges out there, but they often don't have a standardized, consistent form of regulation around that. And there's an understanding that the EU is trying to create some regulations around these kind of bonds. So here's a question which basically asks, foreign institutional investors favor jurisdictions where there is regulatory certainty. So what are some of the key issues in financial regulations and policy that need to be tackled in Asia, where perhaps there isn't as much consistency in the regulations? So who would like to answer that question? Maybe Ellie, you might have some insight on this, working with both government and public-private partnerships.
Well, it's relatively still new in the Philippines, but I think what we did is to put together that sustainable finance framework. And I think this is where we have to map out very specific requirements in terms of regulation, incentives, penalties, insurance mechanisms. How do the sector, at least in the Philippines, the banking sector in the Philippines, respond to that? Have a continuous dialogue, how to comply with all of that? It's really an ongoing, I'll say, work in progress as you go along in terms of policy and regulatory requirements. But as you correctly pointed out, an international set of guidelines would probably help for like regions that are developing still or very at the infancy stages of putting together this kind of instruments. And yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Ernst, perhaps you have some insight in this, as a reinsurer working, how important is regulation around, managing these various bonds that are being issued out there?
Yeah, indeed, it is very important to have clear guidelines, a clear framework, and have the same understanding what green means and blue means, right, and what does it not mean. So it's absolutely essential. It's not just about reputational risk or so. It is about sort of a tangible impact from investing in these bonds. I mean, talking about regulation, you always have people who are not so happy with regulation because you have others sort of providing this guidance or so. But I think when it comes to financial investments, and we have here in Europe, we have these discussions about the EU taxonomy, what is green, what is sustainable, what is not sustainable, natural gas, nuclear, and others or so. But I think it's absolutely valuable to have clear regulation in order to have investments flowing at scale. And by the way, regulation can also mean that there are sort of different shades of green, if you right, allow me to say this or so. And then the investors know what they're investing in or so. But what is not helpful is to have sort of a blurry situation where no one exactly knows what it is. And then, for instance, us as Munich Re, our own investors are calling for a company, for Munich Re, to be very green, very sustainable, and to be very strict with ESG matters and ESG rules. Mm-hmm. So we would rather invest into products which are sort of dark green, if you allow me to say. But others might be fully okay with sort of having lighter green investments or so. But again, regulation, clear framework is helpful in order to have more financial flows into this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, bearing in mind that, the insurance sector is highly regulated as well. So it is nice to have a consistent set of policies that investors can perhaps take comfort in and have some trust in them. As you mentioned earlier, right, one of the big issues is this sense of distrust that investors have because they're worried around the risks of some of these financial products. Now, it's another question here, unless anybody else wants to pick up on that question, I can go on to the next one. This is a question that's directed at Regular. It's our understanding that for the case of global plastic pollution, it is the global plastic polluters who are at the heart of having created the problem, but who are now also the main financiers of the solution. So how do we resolve the tension by incentivizing these polluting industries to invest in changing those parts of their business models that are at the root of the problem? That's a tough question, isn't it? How do you manage to incentivize them? Is it something the government needs to do? Is it something consumers need to do? Should consumers start speaking out about plastic? What do you think is a solution there, Regular?
Well, Well, I think it is really all upon us as individuals, first and foremost, to question our own behavior and our consumption patterns, and as a consumer, right? Then I think really what we see is an increased interest of those corporations to bring the issue at the forefront and core to their strategies. Now, obviously, recycling of material, which packaging they produce themselves is one way to go. But I think another key component or critical component into the future is that we start rethinking our packaging in general, that we don't just go modus operandum, of how it has been done, and really consider design and content standards, right? We need to redesign packaging in general. And I mentioned, for example, I give you, again, a very simple example. A PET bottle today is pretty straightforward and easy to recycle. You have mechanical recycling technologies out there which enable you, if you can trace the material and you get FDA or EFSA approval, to bring it back into a bottle. So that's the premium standard, right? When you, however, look at some more difficult to recycle material like multi-layered material, where we don't have yet the proper and good technology to recycle those. Sachets, for example, are a big issue in Asia, and while PET bottles leaking into the ocean is a big issue, but sachets, the flexibles material is a big issue. And so the question is, yes, you can actually start finding technologies and developing technologies to recycle it. But as another big step is actually to see how can you redesign it so that it is A, better to recycle, and B, maybe even phased out. I think there's another area which corporations look into, is generally, can plastic be replaced? Innovation in you don't need to have plastics for all and everything, right? And there is new technology out there which could be replacing plastic in that sense. But I think policy is also still, while companies and many of these multinationals are at the forefront and have chosen to find solutions, policies also are a key component. And again, in this public-private partnership and finding systemic solutions to play a key role. And here we talk really support of the cohesive ecosystems, which is EPR schemes, right? We talk about design, we talk about collection and sorting policies, we talk about standardization of data, because ultimately, again, we can all say we invest in blue or green, but again, what we also heard from Ernst is, how do we trace that? How do we track that? What is the baseline we're actually talking about, right? How do we really measure impact? So I think this it's a very broad answer to the topic, but at the end of the day, I think it's voluntary to some extent, and then it is also enforced in certain countries through policies, which also then enable, again, a change from a very rather linear solution or linear value chain to a very clearly circular supply chain.
Wonderful to hear, Regula, and really great to know that there are incentives out there to get people to behave right. And another great question has just come in, and I want to ask it. And again, it's open to all of you, so please let me know who'd like to answer this. And this ties in with what we were talking about earlier. It is the small companies, it is the informal sector to some extent as well that's being impacted by a lot of climate change. So here's a question from Rafi Andrew Carrillo. Thank you for this question. How can we encourage SMEs as well to participate in this green movement, especially knowing that most businesses comprise of SMEs here in Asia? So how can we get them to participate in the green movement? What are some of the criteria that we're looking at? Who'd like to take this question?
I'm happy to go quickly. I think SMEs and also startups, particularly when we talk about innovation at the intersection of climate change and circular economy, are absolutely key to build the supply chain or to build the business or investment opportunities of the future, right? Because again, we cannot just, while we can reduce plastic leakage by 80% by 2040 if we invest in existing technologies and solutions, we still need more. We are not yet at net zero. So I think new innovation, new businesses, new ideas are key. However, they often exactly lack access to capital, access to technical assistance, and access to all what they need, the suite of solutions they need to grow to a level where investors like a PE or a VC can even consider them, right? So I think here we need, again, such sort of a blended mechanism. We need philanthropic money possibly to move into the market to enable those SMEs to get to a level where they can qualify for more capital to grow. Ecosystem builders. There are plenty and several of organizations in South and Southeast Asia, which we also support one through our NGO entity or sister entity to enable those companies to get access to that technical assistance and then help them within the ecosystem to navigate, to connect, to get in front of the right investors, in front of the right corporations, and really also, again, understand and be able to navigate the policy environment they need to cater to. So I think, yes, it is key and there is capital needed. And so philanthropic capital to help them, grow initially can be a great way to go, which we haven't addressed here at all.
Thank you for that, Regula. Would anybody else like to take that question? So how can we get SMEs, and Regula mentioned startups as well, how can we get them on board onto the green movement?
Maybe I'll chip in, Saranjit. Yeah, the SMEs are very important components of our economies. In the Pacific, most of the business are actually SMEs or even micro SMEs. And these are often very flexible. They can adapt. So they are better placed to jump onto the green-blue movement. But as Regula was saying, accessing capital is a major stumbling block for these small micro SMEs in the Pacific. So if something can be done to ensure access to financial resources by these very small SMEs, then for the Pacific, it would be a game changer.
May I just build on that very briefly? And so I think there are entrepreneur support organizations out there which really are here to focus on the micro, right? But when we talk SMEs, we invest in SMEs. I mean, this is exactly the role I think financial institutions such as us should play before they are at a scale where institutional investors are, come in to bring in the additional big capital. I mean, we invest in companies which need as little as $500,000, $1 million. Sure, we also invest in companies which need as much as 15 million, right? But I think this whole range, because each country and each location is different, and I think we need just to understand what is the situation on the ground, does the investment landscape look like? And some markets are much more nascent than others. And therefore, if we were not to have that flexibility in some nascent markets to go in very small, then, exactly, these markets would never be built. So I think companies as our investment firms like ours can come in at SME level. And prior to that, exactly, this kind of support organizations are really playing a key role.
No, thank you both, Denton and Regula, for that response. And thank you, Rafi, for your great question. We seem to be getting a lot more questions coming in, and we're just running a little bit short of time, but let me risk one more. And this is really a very interesting question because we have been talking to some degree about infrastructure projects. Certainly, this is something, Ellie, you know a lot about in the PPP space. This question says that infrastructure projects are inherently risky and frequently unprofitable, which makes them unattractive to investors. Now, the G20's response to that is to de-risk the investment, but the risk rarely just disappears. Someone has to take responsibility for underwriting it when a project hits unforeseen problems, overruns, or fails to generate the expected number of paying customers. So in this backdrop, what are your views on developing an infrastructure asset class? Perhaps again, a question for Ellie or Ernst. Would this be something that you'd like to take up?
Ernst, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me start with saying that there is quite a strong interest in the financial service industry to invest into infrastructure. And one of the main reasons being is that these are long-term investments. Us as an insurance company, we are not really interested in buying and selling assets. We are very much interested in investing and for a long period of time, 20 years, 30 years and beyond. And for that, infrastructure is an interesting asset class. Also, it's not formally an asset class, but we have a dedicated team in investing in infrastructure. Indeed, the challenges with infrastructure just have been mentioned: cost overrun, delays, and all these sorts of risks. The private sector insurance industry can help with identifying these risks and also putting a price tag on these risks. There is a lot of experience with infrastructure in our industry. The point then is someone has to carry the risk. The private sector would do as long as the risk premium are adequate and in line with the identified risk. And here is where the bottleneck obviously is. When there is either a disagreement about the level of risk between sort of the infrastructure project itself and the risk management company, so the insurance company, or where there is then no willingness to pay, or sometimes there's simply no money in the project fund. So the project itself has not put money aside to also allow for insurance covers also. But I think if there would be more transparency how these risks could be transferred to the private sector, and sometimes, quite frankly, there needs to be more realism that with all the delays with large infrastructure projects also, obviously the risk premium has to be at a certain level to reflect the realities also. And if sort of both parties, project developers, and those who finance these projects and the insurance industry would sort of come to an agreement about the underlying risks, then there certainly would be more opportunity to share these risks and transfer these risks. And in return, we would see more investors. So it's almost like we started this conversation, this panel about an hour ago. It is about collaboration between all parties involved. That can be the public sector, the private sector, can be public, private, whatever you have it. And we need to be honest and rely also on the expertise of the public sector, who has a very clear expertise with many topics in that space, but also the private sector. And if we sort of work together and build up sort of this trust, there's a certain level of trust, I guess, necessary, then we can overcome these hurdles. And because financing and managing risk is very often about trust. Can we trust our partners? And again, talking again in different formats. I'm getting back to this insurance development forum where we have UN organizations, development banks, the private sector there. So, but there are many other formats out there to engage with all parties involved, and then I would expect we see more infrastructure projects being financed and the risk being managed by private and public-private partnerships.
Sure, add quick addition to what Ernst pointed out. Very good points about risks and trust, and you're very correct in saying that. I think goes back as well to diligent project preparation, structuring of the project. The project, there are instances, and our mechanism example allow that, can be unbundled. As projects, infrastructure projects can be unbundled to very specific components, operations, maintenance, technology, and in the unbundling process, delegate which can best be done by the private sector, which can best be funded by, for example, government resources, provided some form of guarantee. So there are mechanisms to really structure and develop the project in a way that is viable for private sector and therefore enticing as well for these instruments to come in and participate. Again, at the end of the day, diligence in project structuring and preparation and clarifying these risks and how they can best be mitigated still to make the project at the end of the day viable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eli. And if I may add here, so what is also important is to engage the risk carriers at a very early stage in the project development, so that if risks are already identified, they might be sort of mitigated or reduced or so, which reduces then in time also the risk premium or so. And it's again, it's about trust and collaboration.
Yes, quick add. In the Philippines, we put together, Shiranjit, a preferred risk allocation matrix. It's some form of a list of risk undertaken in the previous project in various stages in financing, construction, some form of a template that our projects in the future can take on from in terms of how the risks are identified, what risks are per sector, per type of project, and how can they be mitigated in actual contracts. So some learning from previous projects and moving forward better in putting them together into actual contracts. Thank you.
Thank you both for your responses there. Some really insightful discussion there brought on by risks in infrastructure projects. Really fascinating to hear that they can be, to some extent, mitigated. Here's a question that's a follow-up from what we talked about earlier, and I'm just going to take this one very quickly. We've only really got about 10 to 15 minutes left to our discussion. So this is a question that follows up on what we were talking about in regulation earlier, and obviously the taxonomy defined by Europe versus ASEAN. So the question essentially asks, is there any concern regarding the different taxonomy defined by Europe or ASEAN? Because of course this can lead to difficulty in establishing the financing framework to enable financing conditions in developing countries. That's a great question there from Judy Tay. Thank you so much for that question. Is this something one of you want to pick up very quickly? No? Yes? No? Okay. Well,
I take it very briefly.
Yes, go ahead.
The brief answer is it would be helpful to have a consensus in the definition of regulation. So in all jurisdictions. So if the ASEAN countries and other regions or so would sort of find an agreement on what is green and what is sustainable or so. But if this is not the case, I think that we, as an investor, we could live with it. It's just not sort of the optimum or so. Consensus would be better, but I wouldn't say that's a huge hurdle if different regions come up with different regulation.
Okay, well, thank you for taking that. It's a tough one, isn't it? Now, we are going to just about close because we've just got a few minutes left, but there are some amazing questions on this list here that I want to continue asking, but perhaps these are questions that the ADB can follow up on for many of you in the audience who haven't had a chance to get a response to your questions yet. Because here's a question that to some extent, I guess we've already received. Luja Santa Cruz has asked this, but I'm going to ask it as well. You know, he asked, how can the profitability of blue and green investments be ensured? But my question is going to be phrased slightly differently. I'm talking about obviously the financial innovation that we've been discussing over the last hour for green and blue finance. We know can take many shapes and forms. We heard from all of you about the many shapes and forms that it can take. But some of them we know will succeed while many others will not. So which one, pardon the pun, would you put your money on? So let's start with you, Denton. As a way to close, what would you put your money on?
Well, I think for the Pacific region, There's climate change. We have lived with it, and we realize that it will be with us for eternity until the good Lord returns. So anything, any innovation, any products that addresses climate change is something that is of priority to us. We will very much like to see that those kind of products. I know we are resilient people, but as the storm gets stronger and more intensive, and as they happen more regularly, more frequently, it's becoming difficult to deal with the impacts of climate change. So anything, any product, any innovation that deals with climate change, we would be very interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Denton. Ellie, I move on to you. What are you putting your money on in terms of what's going to succeed in green and blue finance?
I think green bonds, I'd say. In the Philippines, for example, though small, we have since 2016 issued bonds around, sustainable bonds around $4.5 billion US, and a big chunk of that are on green bonds. The next in rank are social bonds and sustainability bonds, around 1 billion or 61 million for the sustainability bonds. I think this is an evolving set of instruments, I would say, Sharanjit. As we go along, this would take some more form, as Ernst was saying, different shades of green. And then this would eventually be responding to the actual needs as we structure a real pipeline of projects. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ellie. Let's move on to Ernst. You were mentioned there in terms of the kind of many products that your company and others in your industry are putting out there. So which one would you put your money on in terms of real success at this point?
Yeah, we already talked a lot about bonds and these financing instruments. We haven't talked about renewable energy projects. Renewable energy projects, solar, wind, and others, and investments into these projects have a very high chance to be profitable, to help reducing the emissions, and help even small communities, and not just in Europe we have this here, but also in the Pacific Islands, others, to create an income and to become become less dependent from fossil fuels, which are imported typically or so. So investing into renewable energy technologies and using also risk transfer solutions, insurance solutions, which allow for guarantee performance of these technologies for up to 20 years, 25 years when it comes to solar or so. That would be helpful and provide investors with a good level of security that they will see the returns which they have planned for.
Thank you, Ernst. And finally, can move to you, Regula. What are you putting your money on, aside from, of course, your own funds?
Yeah, I would say any investment opportunity project which is really tackling the issues systemically, anything which really tries to understand the situations locally on the ground and bring all the key stakeholders together as a strong force, right? Anything which is circular. I think whether that is plastic or it's in fashion or it's in construction or what, you name it, the circle, moving away from a linear way of looking at our resources to a very circular is what I would go for. And then last but not least, and I think really important, is any opportunity which is very transparent on how they measure and address impact, how they measure it, and what the investment really does to bettering the situation we have at hand. And this is whether it's climate change or but really be transparent on how it is measured.
Thank you for that, Regula. And as we come to the close of our session, I'd like to thank all our panelists for these really rich insights that we've been hearing over the last hour in this very important discussion. So how do we use green and blue finance to scale it up quickly enough to try to protect our planet, which of course we know is not only home to a population of nearly 8 billion of us, but is also home to millions of varieties of flora and fauna. And as we heard in this discussion over the last hour or so, there are innovations and solutions. All of you have mentioned it. It's fascinating to hear. And these can protect our fragile planet from further harm. So please, let's all come together to try to work on these solutions together. And with that, I'll hand back to my esteemed colleague, Jost.
Thank you very much, Sharanjit, and all the 4 panelists for this very interesting session. Denton Rarawa, Regula Scheck, Ernst Rauch, and Elea Ricote, and again, Sharanjit Lail for this excellent moderation. So this actually concludes our first session at the Asia Finance Forums this year. And we have prepared a second one for you on crowding in private finance for blue and green innovation. So in the case you cannot be with us at 4 p.m. Manila time, this is when the next session starts. So there is a break of approximately 50 minutes. Then we hope to see you at least again tomorrow, when we are having a keynote by Ms. Shamsta Akhtar, and also session 3 on smart solutions for jumpstarting on inclusive green recovery. And this session will actually be moderated by senior news anchor of CNN Philippines, Rico Hison, formerly also BBC, also no stranger for anybody who watches news in Asia and the Pacific. So there's a lot ahead of us. So we hope to see you all back at 4 p.m. Manila time, 55 minutes from now, and otherwise, hopefully tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining so far, and see you hopefully very, very soon. Have a good break.
Thank you.